You've heard of them in whispers and seen flashes in Hollywood epics. The legendary Greek parties, wild symposiums where wine flowed like rivers and philosophers debated until the stars grew weary. But what were these gatherings truly like? Let me take you back, not just into a time, but into a courtyard glimmering with oil lamps, where the scent of myrrh and roasted lamb fills the air, and where behind tall marble columns, the real story of Greek revelry begins. Long before the myths became myths and the gods slipped into legend, there was Athens, not the romanticized city of marble temples and statuesque philosophers we know today, but a living, breathing metropolis. It pulsed with noise, ambition, laughter, sweat, politics, and whispers behind closed doors. It was a city of rules, honor, and democracy, but also of secrets. And among the most coveted of those secrets was the invitation. An invitation to a symposium. The whispered world Callistratus was the son of a stone merchant, not a noble, but not poor either. He was sharp with numbers, respectful to the gods, and careful never to offend the older men who eyed him from behind olive stalls and temple pillars. At 17, his world was still bound by daylight, training at the gymnasium, errands at the Agra, lectures from his aging tutor whose breath smelled faintly of goat milk and regret, but Callistratus wanted more. He had overheard enough snippets from eavesdropped conversations and tavern ramblings to know there was another world in Athens, one that only truly began after the sun went down. A world where men drank to Dionysus, argued with Socratic fire, and danced beneath oil lamps until the stars dimmed from shame. That world had no name spoken aloud, only whispers. And then, one ordinary morning, it found him got the invitation. It wasn't a scroll sealed in wax or a grand herald. Arriving at his family home, that would have been too obvious, too vulgar. No, the invitation came in the form of a glance and a gesture. He was studying in the shade of a fig tree near the temple of Hephaestus when a man he barely knew, Demetrios, the student of a well-respected sophist, passed by. Demetrios paused, eyes flicking to the scroll in Callistratus' hand. Still reading Hesiod? He asked, voice smooth as wine. Callistratus nodded, standing. There is still much to learn. Demetrios smiled. Good. Then you're ready for the kind of learning that doesn't come from parchment. He leaned in closer. Tonight, 3rd hour past dusk. House of Timon near the Street of the Potters. Wear something clean. Speak only when spoken to. And don't drink too fast. Then he was gone. That was it. The boy's heart thundered louder. Then the temple bells. Preparing for the unknown Callistratos had heard of Timon. Everyone had. The man was older than most, wealthier than most, and more dangerous than all. Not because of any blade or army, but because of his ideas. Some called him a visionary. Others, a corrupter of youth. His house, they said, was where the powerful and the poetic collided, where generals debated with sculptors, where philosophers drank alongside actors, and where courtesans could outwit scholars with a single glance. And now, Callistratus had been invited. He rushed home and bathed until his fingers wrinkled. He chose his cleanest chiton, white with a border of deep indigo. His mother asked where he was going, and he lied, something about a study session. She frowned, but said nothing. As dusk painted the city in purples and bronze, he stepped out into the Athens he had never known. The nighttime Athens. The city beneath the stars Athens at night was a different creature. Gone were the cries of fishmongers and philosophers. In their place came the low throb of lyres and drums behind shuttered windows, the soft perfume of incense and roasted meats drifting from unseen courtyards. Sleighs carried torches. Lovers whispered in alleyways. Stray cats padded silently through streets older than memory. Somewhere in the distance, a drunken chorus sang hymns to Dionysus. or perhaps just bawdy songs about goats. It was hard to tell. The house of Timon stood behind tall cypress trees, hidden behind a wall carved with ivy and masks, smiling, frowning, some with their eyes scratched out by time. At the gate stood a man with a torch and a stern expression. Callistratos swallowed his nerves and gave his name. The man said nothing, merely stepped aside, and the boy walked into the firelight of a forgotten world. The courtyard of promises. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Oil lamps burned in wall sconces shaped like animal skulls. The floor was tiled with images of gods and monsters. Hercules wrestling the Nemean lion, Odysseus bound to the mast, Dionysus reclining with his panther. A dozen couches lined the inner courtyard. Men reclined, chatting and laughing, already halfway through their first craters of wine. Slaves, young boys and girls, nimble as dancers, moved with practiced grace, refilling cups, adjusting cushions, laying down trays of figs, cheese, honey cakes, and olives stuffed with almonds. And there, in the center, was Timon. He wore no crown, no fine robes, just a simple dark cloak. But his eyes, like coins dipped in shadow, saw everything. Callistratos, he said, voice like velvet scraped against stone. The merchant's son, welcome. Callistratos bowed. It is an honor. Timon chuckled. It will be something, at least. Let us see if you can drink like a thinker. Initiation of the mind and mouth before anything began, a small ritual, was observed. Each guest, including Callistratos, was crowned with a fresh wreath of ivy leaves dipped in oil. It was said that Dionysus favored ivy over all other plants. The wreath wasn't just symbolic. Some believed it would prevent drunkenness. They were wrong, of course, but the ceremony mattered. Then came the libation. Each guest spilled a few drops of wine onto the ground, whispering prayers. Some spoke to Dionysus. Others invoked Athena for wisdom or Aphrodite for charm. Callistratos chose silence. As the libation ended, a slender servant girl with long braids placed a kylix, a wide, shallow cup, into his hand. He looked down at the dark red wine, already catching the scent of cloves and resin. A voice from his left, a younger man with mischievous eyes, leaned over and said, "First time?" Callistratos nodded. The man grinned. "Drink slowly, think quickly, and whatever you do, don't argue with Timon unless you're ready to be embarrassed before everyone." He took a sip. It was like swallowing liquid fire and poetry all at once. The first spark the conversations began softly, tales of politics, gossip about the latest plays, complaints about taxes. But slowly, like embers catching wind, they began to blaze. One man questioned the nature of courage. Was it action or the absence of fear? Another claimed that true beauty could only exist in mathematics. Someone across the room responded with a limerick that made half the crowd howl and the other half-groan. Callistratos remained quiet, absorbing it all. The rhythm of laughter, attention before a clever reply, the weight of a silence when a truth landed too heavily to brush aside. And then Timon looked at him. "You," he said, "what is the purpose of pleasure?" The room hushed. Callistratos blinked. The wine warmed his throat. The oil lamps shimmered like stars about to fall. He spoke, uncertain at first, then stronger, to remind us that we are still alive, and that life is not always meant to be endured. Sometimes it is meant to be tasted. A moment of silence, then a smile. "Well said," Timon nodded. "Let's see how long you can keep up." And just like that, Callistratos was no longer a boy in the corner. He was part of the fire. A world unseen by day. As the night stretched onward, he saw dancers move with serpent grace, heard philosophers quote lines of Sappho with tears in their eyes. watched old men argue about the nature of honor, while courtesans fed them grapes and laughed like goddesses in disguise. The party was not chaos. It was ritual, not drunkenness, but revelation. Not noise, but music. Music of words, ideas. Sensations. And in the heart of it all, Callistratus began to understand. This was no ordinary gathering. It was a hidden theater where masks were worn, and sometimes dropped. Here, power meant intellect. Wit was sharper than any blade. And truth. Truth was pursued like a fleeting animal in the forest of wine and firelight. When he finally stumbled out, as dawn kissed the Acropolis in gold, he was changed. Not just older, not just wiser, but initiated into the hidden world. The rules of the Arivel are wide. Sun had risen. Athens was stirring, but in the soul of Callistratus, the night had not yet ended. Though the symposium had dispersed, its echoes clung to his skin like wine stains and incense smoke. He could still hear the laughter ringing off marble walls, feel the dry garland wilting behind his ear, and taste the metallic bite of the wine that had loosed his tongue and tightened his thoughts. But one thing struck him most. Nothing had been random. What had seemed like spontaneous laughter and wild debate had, beneath the surface, followed an intricate choreography, ancient, deliberate, and sacred. This was no ordinary drinking session. This was a ceremony dressed in pleasure, and every ceremony had its rules. The symposiarch, ruler of the night Timon, had not just been the host. He had been the symposiarch, a title as old as the ritual itself. The symposiarch was the evening's master of ceremonies, a guide and a judge, equal parts priest and puppet master. He chose the wine's dilution, for wine in its pure form was considered savage, the drink of uncivilized men. Instead, it was mixed with water in large bowls called craters. Too little wine, and the night would be dull. Too much, and men would speak foolishly, or worse, vomit into the mosaic tiles of the courtyard. Timon, ever the strategist, had chosen a 1-to-3 ratio, 1 part wine to 3 parts water. Enough to loosen lips, not enough to drown minds. Callistratus realized even drunkenness had discipline. The first cup, for health. As the wine began to flow, so too did the formal rhythm of the night. The Greeks believed in a sacred sequence of cups. The first cup was for health, a simple, almost medicinal toast to thank the gods for life and to prepare the body for what was to come. Timon raised his kylix, a shallow-handled cup painted, with scenes of dancing satyrs. To your bones, your breath, and your bearing, he said. May all be strong tonight. Each guest mirrored the motion. They drank, not in haste, but in reverent sips. The first cup was not for pleasure. It was a prayer. The second cup, for love as laughter warmed the room, and fingers relaxed from there. Formal curls. A second round was poured. The second cup was for love. This was when the eyes lingered longer across the room. When verses of Sappho or fragments of Anacreon were recited, their words thick with longing and moonlight. Callistratus listened, enchanted, as one guest, a slender, olive-skinned man named Lysandros, stood to speak. Love shook my mind, like the wind on the mountain, and broke me down, tree by tree. The room sighed. Even the flute girl paused. A courtesan named Melita touched her lips to her cup, eyes flickering toward the speaker. In that gaze, more was spoken than words could contain. Callistratus, cheeks warm and heart louder than reason, caught her glance, or imagined he had, and wondered if he too would one day speak such lines and earn such stares. The third cup. For sleep tradition said that the third cup was the final one. It was for sleep and for a graceful end to the night. But in Timon's house, that rule was observed only in theory. Once the third cup was raised, the ritual portion ended, and anarchy, elegant and shimmering, crept in. The The slaves filled craters more freely. Music grew wilder. Debates sharpened into arguments or dissolved into laughter. Some guests left, their garlands slipping from their heads, like shed halos. Others stayed and entered the deeper current of the symposium, the unspoken games, the secret exchanges, the veiled duels of wit and power, games of the mind, and the flesh shoe. What occurred past the third cup was where the true artistry of the symposium lived. Callistratos had heard of Kotabos, the famed drinking game. It sounded childish from the outside, flicking wine dregs from one's kylix to hit a bronze target across the courtyard, often while reclining. But to play it well required grace, balance, and luck. It was said that the way a man flicked his wrist in Kotabos revealed more about his character than any speech. He watched as an older man, one-eyed and sly, hit the target perfectly while reciting an erotic poem about Zeus and Ganymede. The crowd roared. Another tried and missed, splashing wine on a slave boy's tunic. Laughter erupted, and the symposiarch, ever alert, clapped twice, and the boy was given a fresh garment and the guest a new cup. The rules were not written. They were lived. Those who understood them were rewarded with applause, kisses, and clout. Those who did not were forgotten. The silent rules beyond the wine and games, subtler rules governed the night. Rules no one said aloud, but everyone obeyed. Rule 1. Do not drink past your soul's capacity. Not your stomach, your soul. For when the wine drowned the soul, men forgot their dignity, their cleverness, and their restraint. Timon watched for this. When a man's eyes glazed over and his wit dulled, the host might quietly gesture for a slave to offer him watered honey. Instead, Rule 2. Speak, but know when to listen. Too much silence was cowardice, but too much speech was arrogance. The balance was the dance, and in Athens, the dance mattered more than the destination. Rule 3. No politics after the third cup. This was not a city meeting. There would be no talk of taxes, wars, or legal disputes. Here, only philosophy, poetry, lust, and longing held sway. The role of the courtesans among the most revered guests were the hetairai, women not just of beauty, but of brilliance. They were unlike common prostitutes. Hetairai were trained in poetry, music, history, and rhetoric. They could quote Homer and correct your pronunciation in the same breath, and still leave you enchanted. Melita, the one with the river-dark hair, was such a woman. She had once belonged to a Macedonian general. It was whispered. He had gifted her a silver flute and a poem, and lost both in a game of dice. Now she belonged to no man. She moved from symposium to symposium, like a priestess of Dionysus, and her presence alone made the gatherings holy. She had a rule of her own. It was said she only kissed men who made her laugh. The music between words, as the night deepened, instruments joined the voices. A lyre strummed softly in the corner. A reed flute danced between verses. And in moments of silence, the music spoke louder than words ever could. There was one song, slow, aching, ancient, played as an old guest closed. His eyes and remembered a war no one else in the room had fought. Another, fast, frenzied, right. As young men danced, arms locked, bare feet stamping against cool tiles. Music was not decoration. It was the soul of the night. Punishments for breaking the dance knot. All guests understood the balance. One man, a visiting merchant from Corinth, drank too fast, spoke too much, and laughed at the wrong moment during a story about a mother's death. Timon did not scold him. He simply raised a hand, and two slaves approached. "Friend," Timon said gently, "the night is too sharp for your dullness. Let us not wound ourselves on it." The man was escorted out. The lesson lingered long after, the unspoken end despite all its structure. The symposium never truly ended. There was no formal closing ceremony, no grand goodbye. Guests simply left when the soul had had its fill. Some slipped away alone, others with courtesans or fellow guests. Some wandered the streets until dawn, reminding them of responsibilities. Others sat beneath trees and wrote poetry on bits of clay and bark. Callistratus stayed until the lamps dimmed and the sky began to pale dot as he left. Timon said only, "You remembered to think before you spoke. Come again, but next time, speak before you're too afraid to think." Callistratus bowed, the words etched into him deeper than any lesson from his tutor. He stepped out into the cool hush of the morning, changed not because he had drunk wine, but because he had tasted the ceremony behind the wine, the living, breathing ritual called a Greek party. The courtesans and the power they HL. The air still held the warmth of firelight and laughter, but dawn had painted Athens in soft gold. Streets that had seemed sacred and secret under the veil of night were now exposed in the honest light of day. The spell of the symposium had broken for most, but not for Callistratus. He wandered, dazed and barefoot, his garland of ivy wilted, wine still swimming in his blood. Yet it was not the wine that left his heart racing. It was her, Melita. She had spoken to him once that night. Just once. A single sentence, a playful jab as she passed him on her way to refill her kylix. "Don't stare too long, boy. Flies drown in honey." The courtesans of Athens, the Hetairai, were no ordinary women. They were not wives who obeyed, nor were they common prostitutes who served and disappeared. No, the Hetairai were forces. They ruled in places where men thought themselves in charge. And the symposium? That was their true court. Callistratus had entered the world of Greek parties, thinking he would learn about men. But what he discovered next was how women, these specific women, shaped every word, glance, and fate behind the painted masks of revelry. The rise of the Hetaira too. Understand the power of the Hetairai. You must first understand what they were not in classical Athens. Respectable women, wives, daughters, sisters, were expected to remain indoors. Their virtue was tied to their silence. Athenian wives rarely joined their husbands in public, and never at a symposium. But the Hetairai were educated. They learned to read, recite, compose poetry, and discuss politics. They were trained in music, dance, and philosophy. Many spoke multiple languages, useful when entertaining merchants and generals from distant city-states. Were not bound by household duties or the constraints of dowries and familial alliances. They were free, as much as any woman in the ancient world could be, and with that freedom came danger, beauty, and power. Melita, a story in shadow and flame. No one knew where Melita was born. Some whispered she was Spartan. Others swore she came from Thrace, raised among priestesses of Artemis. She never confirmed any of it. What was certain was this: Melita had arrived in Athens like a thunderclap in a summer storm, unexpected, dazzling, and impossible to ignore. She first appeared at a party hosted by a famous dramatist, wearing a crimson peplus and a chain of tiny gold dolphins around her ankle. She drank only pomegranate wine, quoted Euripides with perfect timing, and made the host laugh so hard he tore his robe out by the end of the night. 3 men had offered to buy her freedom, but Melita had already purchased it herself. With wit, charm, and timing sharper than any Athenian blade, she was now her own woman, a guest of honor, a ghost of scandal, a goddess without a temple, and she was everywhere. The gains of power. When a Hetaira entered a symposium, the balance shifted. Men noticed. They sat straighter, spoke more carefully, recited more eloquently, because a single raised eyebrow from a Hetaira could turn a brilliant argument into a joke, or elevate a joke into a revelation. Melita's presence was like oil on water, always visible, always moving. She moved between groups like a seasoned general inspecting her troops, offering a smile here, a challenge there. One guest claimed that being corrected by Melita was more arousing than being kissed by any other woman in Athens. She didn't just entertain. She edited the night dot at Timon's latest gathering. She'd interrupted a heated philosophical debate, one that threatened to spiral into shouting with a single comment. If courage is only proven on the battlefield, then poets are cowards. And yet, which of you has ever survived a poem? Silence, then thunderous laughter. The argument died. A new discussion was born. And just like that, Melita had redirected the river dot more, and companions, makers of menhetairi, were often seen. On the arms of powerful men, not as decorations, but as mirrors. They reflected brilliance and ambition, and sometimes helped shape it. Pericles, the famed Athenian statesman, was said to be enthralled by Aspasia, a hetaira renowned not only for her beauty, but for her razor intellect. She advised him, challenged him, and perhaps even ghost wrote some of his speeches. She was banned from temples, denounced by rival politicians, and never ignored. Aspasia wasn't an exception. She was the standard for those who could rise high enough. Melita was spoken of in similar terms. She had been seen walking with generals at dusk, sitting beside playwrights at the theater, and once it was rumored, sharing wine with a Spartan envoy in the garden of the Academy dot, in a world where women were meant to be unseen. The hetairi were unforgettable. The cost of power, but freedom came with a cost. Hetairi had no legal protections. If a man grew jealous or violent, she had few avenues for recourse. She could not marry a citizen. Her children, if she had them, would be outsiders. Stateless, inheritanceless. And yet, many of them chose that life, because even in its danger, it offered something most women never touched in Athens. Choice. Choice of lovers, of conversation, of silence. Choice of when to speak and when to walk away. Melita, for all her beauty, wielded her freedom like a blade. She never stayed long in one man's circle, never allowed herself to be caged in loyalty. Callistratos watched her as she listened to an orator recount a campaign in Sicily, her fingers idly stroking the stem of her wine cup. She said nothing for a full 5 minutes, then asked a question so piercing the man forgot his own tale. She turned heads not by volume, but by timing. Kalistratos speaks near the end of the night, when the craters were half empty and the garlands had begun to droop. Callistratos found himself beside her once again. She glanced at him. "You've learned not to stare," she said softly. "I've learned that silence can speak louder than words," he replied. She smiled. "A good lesson, but silence won't get you invited back." He dared. "Then may I ask a question?" She sipped. "You may try. Why come here at all?" He asked. "You could be anywhere, with anyone." She leaned in just a breath closer. "Because here, I choose who I am." And that was the end of it. She rose and vanished into the curve of the courtyard, leaving behind only the scent of myrrh and the echo of her voice. The invisible power when historians write about ancient Greece. They name kings, generals, and philosophers. They speak of war strategies and plays, of temples and treaties. But in the shadows between those stories were the women who shaped the men not with swords, but with stories, with laughter with refusal, with a single glance over the rim of a wine cup. The hetairi were the keepers of balance at the symposium. When debates grew dull, they sparked them. When egos inflated, they popped them. When the night teetered between brilliance and chaos, they guided it. Not like sailors, but like stars. And Melita? She would be at the next party. And the next, maybe. Or perhaps she would disappear entirely, leaving behind only rumors and poems, and a young man named Callistratos, who now knew that the greatest power in the room might not be the man who spoke the most, but the woman who didn't need to. Athens had always been a city where thoughts lived louder than swords. Its streets were carved not just with stone, but with questions. Questions whispered beneath olive trees, chiseled into marble benches, and shouted in the echoing halls. Of the Agra Dock, but no place in Athens, echoed with deeper thoughts than the symposium. Not because of the setting, though it was always exquisite. Not because of the company, though it was always cunning. It was because wine, the sacred drink of Dionysus, loosened the tongue and unlocked the soul. And when that happened, when the golden haze of inebriation met the furnace of thought, something truly Greek was born. Not just drunkenness, not just debate, but a strange alchemy, the sacred collision of philosophy and intoxication. Callistratos, now a frequent guest at Timon's symposia, had come to realize that every night held this strange tightrope between brilliance and foolishness, between divine ideas and slurred nonsense. The most revered guests weren't those who drank the most, but those who knew when to drink and when to speak. The fire in the furnace, the first time Callistratus watched Timon debate while drunk. He thought it was madness. The old philosopher had consumed 3 full cups of wine, strong, dark, and heady, and still leaned forward, eyes like wet coals, drawing a diagram of a soul in ash across the marble tabletop. You see, Timon had slurred, the soul is not a chariot. No, it is the rider who is drunk, and the horses are desire and discipline. If you pull too hard on either, you end up in the ditch. Someone laughed. Timon ignored him. The problem is, most of you have never tried to ride drunk. You try to drive the soul with rules. But when you drink, that's when the real rider steps out. Naked, honest. He pointed at Callistratos. You, boy, what have you learned? Since you began drinking with us? Callistratos hesitated. The room was silent. He took a sip, not to stall, but to align himself. That the body blurs and the mind sharpens, he said, but only briefly. And then both fall apart. Timon grinned. Exactly. That brief moment, that is where truth hides. Why? Drunkenness was sacred in modern times. We think of drunkenness as foolishness, something to avoid or hide. But in ancient Athens, controlled intoxication was something else entirely. It was a ritual to the Greeks. Dionysus was not merely a god of wine. He was the god of madness, ecstasy, revelation. Wine wasn't meant to dull the senses. It was meant to peel them back. Drunkenness, in the sacred context of the symposium, was not an escape. It was a return to something primitive, essential, and honest. And when philosophy met, this state of altered consciousness, what came forth was often profound. Men who feared speaking truth in the daylight found their courage in the candlelight. Debates about virtue, justice, love, and fate took on the flavor of passion rather than formality. Socrates himself, that juggernaut of Athenian thought, was known for his drinking endurance. He could outdrink any man, yet remained eerily lucid. Plato described in his Symposium how Socrates, even after drinking deep into the night, could still speak with clarity that cut through confusion like lightning. And this was the model many followed. Not to drink to forget, but to drink to remember who they really were. The art of debate in the fog one particular night. The theme of the symposium was friendship, not love, but the sacred bond between men. A soldier argued that friendship was forged only in battle. A playwright claimed it was built in shared secrets. Melita, reclining nearby, said nothing, until Callistratos turned to her and asked, "What do you think friendship is?" She smiled slowly. The kind of silence you don't want to fill. That night, the argument burned hot. Timon, half drunk but precise, declared, Friendship is the soul recognizing itself in another, not always liking what it sees, but choosing to remain anyway. A young merchant disagreed. A soul cannot see itself in another, he said. It can only be fooled by reflection. The debate grew tense. Voices rose. Wine spilled dot, and just as it seemed, it would collapse into noise. An old poet named Phocion, who had said nothing all evening, whispered, "True friendship is drinking from the same cup, and not fearing poison." Silence followed dot. It wasn't just the cleverness of the words. It was the drunkenness behind them. He wasn't showing off. He was revealing dot the room understood, dot the subject changed. The truth had landed. When wine turns words to fire, there were, of course, dangers to this sacred madness. Not every man could walk the line between intoxication and insight. Many fell. Some drank too deeply and mistook babble for brilliance. Others lost their temper, forgetting that wit was more prized than strength at the symposium. One guest, a military commander known for his brutality, once slammed his cup down after being mocked by a courtesan for his poor logic. He stood, red-faced. "You dare insult a man who commands thousands?" Timon, eyes steady despite the wine, replied, "Only men who feel small shout about how many soldiers they own. Sit down before your shame becomes our entertainment." The room froze. The commander blinked, sat, said nothing else the rest of it. The night. Because at the symposium, your mind was your weapon, and the wine simply stripped away the scabbard. The role of music and mood philosophy was never constant. It rose and fell with the rhythm of the night. When debates grew too heated, music intervened. A lyre would play, soft, silver, slow, and the mood would shift. Words would fade into hums, arguments into stories. Callistratos learned to watch the rhythm like a tide. When the wine was just right, and the music low, and the firelight flickering, that was the moment to speak. One night, when the theme was truth, he stood and said, "Truth is not what survives argument. It is what survives forgetting." Heads turned. Even Timon nodded. He was learning, not just how to drink, but how to think while drunk. The most sacred skill of all. The madness of the gods' drunkenness, in Greek belief, was not shameful. It was divine, if done with grace. To be drunk was to be touched by Dionysus, but to speak clearly while drunk, that was to channel Apollo through the haze. The two gods, one of madness, one of reason, warred within the soul of every symposium. Some guests surrendered to Dionysus completely, dancing, laughing, kissing, collapsing. Others clung to Apollo, analyzing, debating, refining every phrase. But the greatest nights? Those belonged to the few who could channel both, letting madness and reason weave together like harmony and melody in a haunting song. That was what philosophy meant at these gatherings. Not cold reasoning, but heated clarity, the fire of the drunk mind, shaped by the discipline of thought, the dawn of clarity as always. The symposium ended not with a speech, but with a silence. Not an awkward silence, but the deep, contented quiet of men who had emptied both their cups and their minds. Callistratos sat, his head bowed, his mouth still tingling with the words he hadn't spoken. He looked up at the stars, now fading in the dawn sky, and whispered a question he didn't know he had held. Who am I when the wine wears off? Beside him, Melita, half asleep, murmured without opening her eyes. That's the only question worth asking. The morning after, regret, reflection, and aritials. The first rays of morning sunlight fell like soft fingers over Athens, not triumphant or blazing, but gentle and golden, as if even Helios himself respected the silence of the city's slow. Awakening. And nowhere was that silence deeper, more reverent, than in the houses where wine had flowed like rivers the night before. The symposium had ended. The laughter had faded into memory. The music now lived only in the ears of the recently sobered Dot, and in the home of Timon the Elder, in the shadowy courtyard that just hours ago pulsed with wit and wine, lay Callistratos, half buried in his own chiton, one sandal missing, and the faint taste of honey and ash still on his tongue. His mouth was dry, his limbs heavy, but his thoughts clearer than ever, because the morning after a Greek party was not just about recovering. It was about reckoning Dot, and in Athens, even a hangover had meaning. Waking in the temple of Exus Callistros stirred slowly, blinking against the new sun. Around him, the ruins of the night lay scattered like battlefield debris, a spilled crater. Its red-stained base cracked like a wounded amphora. Garlands, once fresh, now curled and browned, drooping from benches and bowls. The smudged outlines of sandal prints in the fine courtyard dust. A flute, silent now, resting beside. An overturned wine cup, as if exhausted. Beside a low pillar, a young man slept with one arm cradling a lyre. Farther off, a pair of guests murmured quietly, heads bent close together, voices hoarse from too much laughter and not enough water. Callistratos touched his temples. Pain bloomed, not sharp, but dull and ancient, the kind that carried with it not just a physical ache, but the echo of everything spoken the night before. He tried to remember, and that's when it began. The regretted always began with the regret. Even among the sharpest minds, the most disciplined tongues, there was always something one wished unsaid. For Callistratos, it was a careless comment he had made to a scholar near the end of the night. A joke about Spartan simplicity, intended to amuse, but met with a cold stare. Simplicity, the man had replied, requires strength, not mockery. And Callistratos had laughed, too loud, too dismissively. Now, in the clean cruelty of daylight, that laugh echoed like a bell of shame. Others stirred. Some rubbed their eyes. Others looked away from one another, unwilling to face the mirror of memory just yet. A few guests rose and left without a word, their regrets too loud to silence with politeness. But most stayed, because they understood that the morning after was as much a part of the symposium as the drinking itself. The rituals of recovery Timon, ever the host, appeared not long after, upright, composed, his hair damp from a recent bath. Bread, he said simply to his servants, and olives. Cold water with honey, nothing else. The courtyard came slowly to life. Trays were passed. Cups were filled, not with wine, but with kykeon, a bittersweet mixture of water, barley, and herbs, meant to calm the stomach and stir the senses. One by one, the guests began the sacred rite of eating in silence. Not it wasn't forced. It was understood. After a night of so many words, the body demanded nourishment while the mind arranged the puzzle pieces of recollection. Callistratos nibbled on a fig. It tasted like dusk. The reflection, it was during these mornings that the deepest thoughts surfaced, not in the fire of argument, but in the glow of introspection. The symposium was like a wave, wild and cresting at night, crashing loudly with ideas and laughter. But the next morning, the waters receded, and the truths left behind could now be seen clearly, like shells glistening on wet sand. Timon sat beneath a myrtle tree, sipping slowly from his clay cup. He motioned for Callistratos to sit. "You spoke well last night," he said without looking. Callistratos blinked. "I said many things. True, some better than others. That's how it always is. But you listened better than you spoke. And that is rarer than wisdom." A pause. Did I offend the scholar? Callistratos finally asked. Timon shrugged. Probably. But offense is a sign of breath. Better that than silence. You'll learn to strike harder and fairer in time. Callistratos nodded, swallowing both pride and relief. Around them, others began murmuring too, Not arguments, but soft evaluations. I think I was too harsh to Lysandros. Did you hear what Melita said about longing? I've never thought of it that way. Next time, I won't quote Pindar after my third cup. These conversations were like polishing the blade after battle. Athenian intellect didn't end with the wine. It grew after it. The unwritten tradition. What modern minds might mistake for mere remorse was, in Athens, part of a cultural ritual. The Greeks didn't separate revelry from reason. They understood that wisdom often emerged, not in the heat of the moment, but in the ashes of indulgence. The morning after the symposium was not a hangover, that it was a cleansing, a spiritual examination, a moment to weigh what was said, what was meant, what was revealed. Because wine does not lie. It simply unmasks, and once the masks fell, what did the men think of their true faces? That was the question Athens asked every morning. Melita's farewell, she had stayed late again. Melita never left first, nor did she linger so long as to be forgotten. She left precisely when she chose. That morning, she emerged from the shade like a cat returning to the temple. She wore a simple robe of lavender linen, her hair bound with silver wire, her face bare of any pretense. She didn't speak to many, just a few words here and there dot to timing. As always, your parties are lessons wrapped in laughter. To a young poet, keep writing, but burn more than you share. Trust me. And to Callistratos, as she passed him by, don't be afraid of regret. It means you remember. Then she was gone, as gracefully as she'd arrived. And somehow, the courtyard felt emptier without her, as if the soul of the night had finally departed. The return to the city eventually. The guests left, some went, home to their families, still wearing garlands half-shredded. Others returned to empty rooms, clutching fragments of ideas they would later etch into wax tablets. Callistratos walked slowly through the waking streets of Athens. The city looked different after a symposium, less sharp, more forgiving. Or maybe that was him. He paused near a public fountain, cupped water into his hands, and splashed his face. It stung Dot, but it woke him up Dot, and as the last haze of wine left him, so too did his illusions, the ones he hadn't known he carried. When the mind sobered, the soul began. That was the lesson of the morning after Dot. It wasn't about regret, Dot. It was about integration. The man you were during the symposium, the clever, reckless, revealed self, had now to meet the man you were in daylight. If the two could shake hands, you had grown. If not, then you still had much to learn. Callistratos understood now. Greek. Parties weren't wild for wildness' sake. They were trials. You entered a furnace of wine, women, and words, and emerged not burned, but reforged. And the morning after was when you examined the blade. By now, Callistratos understood the rhythm of a Greek night. The laughter, the flirtation, the philosophical sparring. He had learned to drink without drowning, to speak without stumbling, and to listen, truly listen, with a mind sharpened by silence. But what he had not yet encountered, not truly, was the one force even more intoxicating and more perilous than wine itself. Politics. In Athens. It floated everywhere like dust in the sun. You breathed it in unknowingly. It clung to every cloak and sandal, whispered in every columned hall and crooked alley. And though the symposium was meant to be a space apart, a sanctuary of pleasure, wit, and grace, sooner or later, politics found its way in. And when it did, the night could turn. Dangerous. The setting of the storm, the invitation came on. Papyrus dyed midnight blue, tied with gold string. Timon, ever the generous host, was stepping aside, just for the night. The gathering would be held at the home of Nicomedes, a rising statesman whose recent speeches in the assembly had made both admirers and enemies. Man of ambition, a man who played with fire, Callistratus hesitated. He had heard whispers that Nicomedes used his symposia to measure minds like weights on a scale, to bait rivals into carelessness, to twist the drunk tongue into an instrument of betrayal. But curiosity, that most Athenian of instincts, won dot, and so he went. A different kind of feast Nicomedes' villa, perched on the side of the Areopagus hill, overlooking the city like a predator on a branch. Inside, it glittered with quiet menace. No laughter greeted guests at the door. No flute played in the courtyard. No garlands were offered. Instead, a wide marble table stood at the center of the room, surrounded by low couches. On the table, rather than fruits or bread, were scrolls, open, heavy with ink, records of trials, accounts of debts, names. Callistratus understood instantly. This was no ordinary night. This was a game of minds and motives. The forbiddens. Topicate was common knowledge. No politics after the third cup. Timon had repeated that rule so many times, it had become a kind of chant dot. But at Nicomedes' symposium, politics was poured as freely as wine, maybe more. Debate began not with poetry, but with policy. Taxes, land reforms, naval power, the threat of Sparta. These were not just topics. They were tests. The host sat high on a stone chair, his fingers steepled, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Callistratus felt it almost immediately. This was not a place to reveal your heart. It was a place to guard it. A city divided too. Understand the danger of politics in a Greek party. One must first understand the nature of Athens itself. Athens was not a dictatorship. It was not a monarchy. It was a democracy, but not as we know it. Power shifted like sand. Speeches moved thousands. Enemies hid in the same bathhouses as allies. And behind every public decision stood private whispers. In such a city, the symposium was a rare space of freedom, but only if everyone respected the unspoken rules. Break them, and the consequences were not just social. They could be lethal. The man with the scar halfway through the night. A man named Thersippos began to speak. He had a thick voice and a scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone. A gift, it was said, from a Sicilian duel. He sipped from his cup and said, casually, if the assembly had any spine, they'd exile Phidon. The man sells timber and calls it strategy. The room stiffened. Phidon was powerful, connected, and his spies were known to attend symposia in disguise, sometimes as slaves, sometimes as flute players. But Thersippos went on. And Nicomedes here, of course, is too modest to say it, but half of Athens would vote him in tomorrow if the choice were honest. A murmur, a cough. Callistratus watched as Nicomedes said nothing, merely lifted his cup and took a long, deliberate drink. The message was clear. I did not speak, but I did not stop him either. And in that silence, alliances formed. Invisible, yet as binding as contracts. The cost of a word, the true currency of Athenian politics, was not silver. It was speech. One phrase, careless, clever, or cutting, could make or unmake a man. Symposia like this were where reputations were minted, or shattered. A poet named Damocles, emboldened by the drink and the approval of Nicomedes, began to rant about the need to limit citizenship. Too many immigrants, he claimed, were weakening the purity of Athens. Callistratus flinched. So did a few others, but none spoke yet, and that was the danger. When politics crept into pleasure, cowardice often arrived with it. A dangerous interruption. Then, without warning, a new voice spoke from the shadows near the column. Melita, no longer a guest, a specter. She had arrived, unannounced, as always. What purity is found in stone scraped bare? She asked softly. If Athens refuses the blood of others, it will choke on its own. Silence. Even Nicomedes leaned forward. Melita walked slowly into the lamplight. She wasn't wearing her usual bright robes, just a plain white tunic cinched tightly. She looked more priestess than Courtesan. She smiled. Did I come at a bad time? Laughter cracked the tension. Even the poet blushed, but Melita didn't laugh. She sat, took a cup, and said nothing more. Her words had already hit their mark. In the walls later, as the night unraveled, Callistratos leaned near Melita. You risked much. She shrugged. Men risk kingdoms to be right. I risk nothing to say what they won't. But if someone reports you... She turned to him, her eyes like blackened coals. Let them. Let them try to cage a shadow. It wasn't just poetry. It was a truth of their time. Speech was dangerous. But silence? Even more so. Aftermath that night, the party ended without music. No one danced. No one embraced. They left in twos and threes, murmuring, weighing words, remembering who laughed and who didn't. The next morning, a rumor spread in the Agra. Thursipos had been detained by the city guard. No charges. No explanation. Another whisper said. Damocles had been denied entry into the Odeon, barred from performing his latest work. And Nicomedes? He announced, days later, that he was stepping down from his role as ambassador, citing exhaustion. No one believed it. Everyone knew the real reason. He had revealed too much too soon. Lessons etched in wine that week, Callistratos returned. To Timon's house, seeking sanctuary. The old philosopher met him with warm bread and cool water. You've learned, Timon said. That wine reveals the soul. But politics? Politics reveals the knife behind the smile. Callistratos nodded. Then tell me, Timon continued, what is more dangerous? A cup of strong wine, or a soft word in the wrong ear? Callistratos didn't answer. He didn't need to. Final reflection. Greek parties were never just parties. They were mirrors. They were stages. They were traps and triumphs, revelations and reckonings. When politics crept into the symposium, it brought the weight of the polis with it, the weight of power, betrayal, and ambition, and those who could not swim in such currents, they drowned in silence. The moon hung over Athens like a coin balanced on the lip of fate, silver, silent, and watching. In the inner chambers of Timon's villa, where laughter and philosophy had long echoed off marble walls, a different kind of silence now settled. It wasn't the hush of reverence. It was the pause before a pulse quickens, because this night, this gathering, would not be about politics or virtue or truth. It would be about games. Not the childish kind, not the athletic kind, but the kind that leave hearts bare and breath uneven. Tonight, the symposium would slip its intellectual cloak and reveal what always pulsed beneath. Desire, and not just desire of the flesh, though there was plenty of that, but the desire to be seen, to be wanted, to possess, if only with a glance, a smile, or a carefully spoken line of poetry. This was seduction, Greek style. And it was not about conquest. It was about control, the arrival of the beautiful. Stranger, it began with a rumor. A new guest was to attend, a foreigner. Some said from Ionia, others whispered Syracuse. A man named Alex on tall, elegant, with eyes like the sea after a storm. He was not a soldier, not a politician, not even a known poet, but he was beautiful. And in Athens, beauty was never just skin deep. It was a currency, an influence, a weapon. When Alexan entered Timon's courtyard that night, he did not bow, did not boast, did not even speak. He only smiled, and within minutes, half the room had turned toward him like sunflowers seeking light. Even Melita, who had once declared herself immune to beauty, tilted her head in faint amusement. The setting of the game that night, Timon did something rare. He changed the layout of the couches. Instead of the usual semicircle around the food and wine, The seating was arranged in intertwining spirals, like a labyrinth carved into marble. Guests sat close, deliberately so, elbows brushed, robes tangled. Cups were passed from hand to hand. The servants brought platters of pomegranate seeds, honey-drenched figs, and roasted nuts sprinkled with cinnamon. All foods that heightened heat. The air thickened. A flute played, not the lively tunes of past nights, but a slower, darker melody. Even the torches burned lower. Something was shifting. At first, Lysistratos sat across from Alexin, not beside. That had been deliberate. He didn't want to be obvious. But even from across the spiral, he felt it. The gaze. Alexin's eyes found him once, briefly, and held. Not long, not overt. But enough to unspool the comb Callistratos had. Brought into the night. It wasn't just attraction. It was invitation, but not the kind that said, "Come to me." It was the kind that said, "Let's see if you dare." Desire in ancient Athens to understand seduction at a Greek party, one must forget modern rules. Desire in Athens was not hidden behind doors. That it was spoken, that it was sung, that it was performed. Men courted men. Women courted poets. Courtesans seduced philosophers. And sometimes, seduction had nothing to do with touch. It was about attention. The flicker of the eyes when a particular guest entered. The way a line of Sappho was recited to the wrong person. Or the right one. Desire lived in the gaps. The space between fingers. Between sentences. Between glances. And that night, the room was full of those gaps. The courtesan's dance Melita took to the center of the spiral not to speak, but to move. She didn't dance in the way of temple rituals or Dionysian frenzy. Her movements were subtle, slow, deliberate. She twirled a sheer veil around her wrist, then around her throat, never letting it fall. She danced near men, not for them. As if asking, "Will you come closer? Or will you only watch?" Callistratos watched. So did Alexin. When she stopped, there was no applause, only stillness. Melita returned to her place, took a sip of wine, and murmured, "Desire is not hunger. It's a question." Games played without words. As the night deepened, the games began. Not dice, not riddles, but games of presence. A poet recited verses of longing, but never named who they were about. A courtesan sang a line from an old love song, but changed the final word to leave the ending uncertain. Laughter came softer now. Touch came more easily. Callistratos felt the shift. The wine was warming his limbs, but it was the glances that were making him dizzy. He found himself reaching for a fig at the same time as Alexin. Their fingers brushed. Neither moved. The ancient art of flirtation to flirt in ancient Greece was to challenge. You did not flatter. You provoked. You did not confess. You alluded. Callistratos tried a line he'd once heard from Timon. "You look like someone who's already been loved too well." Alexin didn't smile. He answered, "And you sound like someone who's afraid to try." The reply was not cruel. It was correct. Callistratos flushed. The game was on. The unwritten boundaries it's important to understand. Not every seduction at a Greek party was physical. Some were intellectual. Some were emotional. Some were merely a moment. A look that never became more, but lingered in the mind like perfume on a pillow. Desire was sacred, not because it always led somewhere, but because it revealed what mattered. To want someone's eyes on you, their attention, their approval. That was the truest mirror. At symposia. Men did not confess desire. They played it like a lyre, plucking each string to see what note would tremble. The kiss that wasn't, it happened late, when the stars were low and the moon had begun to fade. Callistratos and Alexin stood near the columned edge of the courtyard. Just within the torchlight's reach. No one else was near. Alexin leaned in. Close, not too close, but then stopped. I never kiss first, he whispered. Callistratus felt his breath catch. He wanted to, but something in him held. Perhaps it was the spell of the game and the desire not to end it, So he said, "Then let this be the night you don't kiss at all." Alexan smiled and walked away. The afterglow of almost, when the guests left, they did so slowly, there were no arguments to remember, no regrets to bury. Only the warmth of things almost said, and sometimes that was the greater pleasure. Callistratus sat beneath the fig tree, alone now, the taste of wine fading from his tongue. He wasn't disappointed. He was haunted, in the best way. Desire, he now understood, wasn't about fulfillment, it was about awakening. Final. Reflection Greek parties were never just wine and ants. They were rituals. Of revelation, of restraint. Of reaching across space, not to possess, but to invite. Desire at a symposium wasn't crude. It wasn't hidden. It was crafted. A brush of the hand, a line of poetry, a kiss withheld. And the beauty of it all was that even when nothing happened, everything changed. Beyond the wine and walls, Athens was many things. A cradle of philosophy, a battlefield of ideologies, a forge of art, ambition, and reason. But beneath the debates in the agora, beneath the Stoic statues and marble steps, there lived a quieter world, a hidden theater of candlelight and whispers, where truth came not through law or speech, but through revelation. This world was the symposium, a place where wine was not a drink, but a key. Desire was not shameful, but sacred. Laughter and wit cut deeper than swords. Regret and reflection were embraced, not feared. Minds met more intimately than bodies ever could. For men like Callistratus, the symposium was not just an evening pastime. It was a second education, a school of honesty, of nuance, of seduction and silence. It was where the mask of daily Athenian life was set gently aside, and the soul, raw and glowing, was finally allowed to breathe. The real lessons of the party we often imagine the ancients as distant, stone-faced, sculpted, silent. But at these parties, they were just like us, curious, conflicted, bold one moment, afraid the next, laughing too loud, regretting too late, longing to be heard, even more to be seen. What Greek parties were actually like was human. Not perfect, not always wise, but utterly alive. And in that, perhaps, lies their greatest truth, that before politics, before philosophy, before war and empire and history books, we were people, just people, trying to understand each other in the glow of flickering torchlight over one more cup of wine. And so the night ends. The lyre plays its final note. The courtesan gathers her cloak. The philosopher refills his cup, not to drink, but to toast. And somewhere, long after the last guest has slipped into the dawn, a thought remains. What we celebrate reveals what we value, and how we gather reveals who we truly are. In the end, Greek parties were never just about indulgence. They were about intimacy, intellect, emotion, and the ancient dance between who we are and who we wish to be. Asterisk if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please like, subscribe, and share our YouTube channel. Sleep Story Room. Your support helps us continue creating good content to inform and inspire you. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. Very informative video. Stay blessed.